Campaign is 2 days. 2 days of official campaign left. That is today and tomorrow. And we want to talk about Chapter 6 now, that chapter on integrity and leadership. We know a lot that has happened. We know how that was watered down. Perhaps you don't, and we will try and give you an insight into that today. But to just talk about why we should be thinking about integrity, why it is so important, and how we can make this real as we head towards the election. And to discuss this with me right here this morning on Choice 2013, we will start on my extreme right. We have Apollo Mboya, who's the CEO of the Law Society of Kenya. Thank you for joining us. Yes. We have David Ohito, our very own digital editor at The Standard, and Wangoi Kaniaru, thank you very much, a lawyer here in Nairobi. Let's start by talking about Chapter 6 on leadership and integrity. Perhaps we can begin with you, Apollo, and on what it was initially meant to be. What was the spirit of Chapter 6 before we even get into understanding how it was watered down?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, Chapter 6 was intended to outline certain criteria of leadership and certain conduct that is a clod for a state officer. Now, Chapter 6 was to provide how a state officer is supposed to conduct themselves, how they are supposed to bring honor and dignity to that office that they hold, and how to promote the integrity generally. Okay. Of operations in government. All
right. So then, David, what happened along the way? Because sometimes we keep talking about how it was watered down, but can you explain to us then what happened? Apollo has mentioned the original intention of it. Why isn't it the same today?
Well, thank you, Yvonne. There's been what was lined out as the latent spirit of the Constitution, and what personal integrity of individuals holding such offices would look like, their personal competence and suitability for office. And then there was the lot that we had in the last parliament before this general election. And we were confronted with the dilemma of the Leadership and Integrity Act. Going by what happened in parliament and the state of the law that was enacted, many critics, including the media, have said it falls far short of what was envisioned in the Constitution. Kenyans were very clear in their mind when they were collating views about leadership and integrity, and how they would want public and state officers to look like. But I'm afraid maybe our lawyer friends will tell us what really went wrong and what can be done going forward.
Indeed, Wangoi. What went wrong? And having a discussion like this, many will say, well, it was already watered down. So, you know, the whole thing about looking at leadership and integrity, and we have no way to be able to enforce that anymore. Is that true?
Not quite. I think a challenge with looking at leadership and integrity as a matter of law and of rules is that it fails to acknowledge that people have to take personal responsibility for their actions. I think for a long time in Kenya's governance and leadership positions, there was not a sense of accountability. All you had to do was evade detection. And so it's as much a process of understanding what personal responsibility looks like and demanding it from our leaders. Okay. By itself, the law cannot prescribe those things. It's up to citizens to demand them of the people that they elect into office.
Okay, and that is why we're talking about it today, that there is still hope, even though certain aspects of it were watered down, that we still do have the power in our hands to be able to tell the, the leaders that we're picking leaders based on this is the threshold. Let's talk about that threshold. What should it be for the voter going forward? We have between today and Monday, some voters still undecided, some are decided, but what should be our minimum threshold as the electorate to say, this is what's acceptable, this is what's not?
Yeah, thank you again. As the Law Society, we always believed that going the judicial route to try and enforce Chapter 6 was going to be a tall order. So what has remained is social vetting. We cannot vet through the judiciary. Yeah. And indeed, the Commission on Implementation of the Constitution went to court on the same law that was supposed to give life to Chapter 6 of the Constitution. And they confronted the case by saying that it does not meet the constitutional threshold, so it should be declared unconstitutional. But they never succeeded. So it has now fallen back to the public, social vetting. What is the minimum? The public must interrogate the history of candidates, must interrogate the track record, must interrogate what they say, and also look at their manifestos, engage with them, and ask whether what they are saying can be achieved. Going back, the public must also look at various reports that have been there, that have investigated several issues, several scandals, and then reach a judgment on whether a particular candidate is suitable for a public office.
Okay, so I like that you've mentioned that this goes now to social vetting.
Yes.
Because we've seen the Supreme Court say they don't have the jurisdiction to decide on whether they can. And there's been this great passing of the buck from one commission to another, one institution to another. Ideally, going forward, is this something that we hope to see to rectify and say, okay, for 2017, let's say this is the person that should vet the candidates. Initially, David, it was meant to be the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission. That didn't happen. Who ideally should be the one to vet the candidates and say, you are fit to run, you are not?
Well, I like what Apollo say, that it boils down to social vetting. And then it begs the question, then why should we be vetting the good judges that are leading judiciary and so on, and other state officers? We vetted the Inspector General and the deputies. Why should we not do the same with those who are seeking elective positions? But if you go forward with what Apollo is proposing, that is back to social vetting, how would my mother back in Ugenya, the rural village, have access to those reports of land commission, reports on corruption?
Absolutely.
She's barely literate sometimes. How would that old lady in Turkana, in Samburu, in Tana River make that informed decision without even having access to such reports? So it really puts in doubt whether we can really implement it. And then the big question, which I would expect Wangoi and Apollo to tell us, how far can social vetting go? We had 2 presidential debates the other day. Were they satisfied from the legal standpoints that these really form some basis of social vetting?
Okay, and indeed challenges with social vetting, and thank you for bringing that up. Not everybody has access to that report. We have the middle class and the elites in the big cities and towns in Nairobi, Kisumu and Eldoret, but for the most part elections and voting will be done by Kenyans from all walks of life, and some of them may not necessarily say, okay, this was abuse of office or money was misappropriated here and there. But let's start by one of the opportunities I think that Kenyans had to vet their presidential candidates in particular, and those are the presidential debates. The last one happened on Monday this week. Were you satisfied with some of the answers that they gave? Did they seem to be able to, because I think in this particular debate, if you remember, there was something on everybody. I think they came up and said, well, you have a case to answer in terms of this, you have this issue in your past. Do you feel that that was adequate enough?
No, it was a necessary first step, but it was not sufficient, for the simple reason that, up there, barring the exception of Mr. Dida, who as yet has no skeletons to hide in terms of office, everyone else was passing the buck. I think that the consensus by the end of all the trading of accusations was that mistakes were made, investigations were conducted, audits were concluded. But apparently nobody did anything, and business as usual for the next 5 years should anyone be elected. So I think a necessary first step is asking the questions. A necessary first step is putting people on the spot for things that have happened on their watch. But we must go further, and this is where the media comes in. I think the point that was raised of people not having access to this information is very relevant to how the media covers corruption. There's a sensationalistic approach that doesn't actually educate citizens on exactly what is expected of government. There's also a sense that the systems in place are not being questioned hard enough, because most of these scandals are procurement scandals. They're scandals to do with loose interpretation of law or loopholes in the system, and the only way to close a loophole is to identify it and to explain why it matters.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So talking about that, and it is a necessary step in terms of asking those questions, but some would say, according to what some of those candidates said, A commission of inquiry was instituted. I was found to have no blame. It was willing buyer, willing seller. Some would say then that it looks like we're conducting a witch hunt. I mean, it's innocent until proven guilty, and some of those commissions of inquiry found them with no wrongdoing. Apollo, what would you say to that?
Yes, that is true. And as lawyers, we always give the benefit of doubt first. Everybody is you are innocent until proven guilty. But coming back to issue of social vetting, and it's true what Oito is saying, that not so many people have got access to information of what the track record of a particular candidate is. Well, the main problem started with the way we have done civic education. With the advent of Chapter 6, we needed to reorient how we do civic education. That is where it should have started from. We didn't get it right. The civic education that is required under this new constitution in light of Chapter 6 must be reoriented. And again, civic educators can think about this so that we get it right in the next election. We cannot do civic education the way we used to do it before, of telling people that this is the color of voting is this, the constitution says this, and this is how you're going to line up and vote. It has to be different.
Well, some would say that the whole issue of Chapter 6 and leadership and integrity really is a reflection of our morality as a society. We seem to reward leaders who we know have scandals, who we question where they got their money from, but we still seem to do it because the law by itself will continue to do that. But as long as this is an election, this is a democracy, we choose the people who we choose to go in. And so my question is, how do we make Chapter 6 then part and parcel of ourselves? Because even during the primaries, we saw some leaders make it through, even with questionable character. But it was still the people that chose them. So whether the law exists or it doesn't, it still at the end of the day falls down to the electorate, does it not? So how do we make sure that Chapter 6 is real in my mind as I go now to the polls on March the 4th? Legislation is one thing, ladies and gentlemen, but you know, getting people to vote in the right individuals is another. Do we agree?
Yes, the responsibility of breathing life to Chapter 6 falls on several players. Starting with the judiciary, you can take up a matter, and based on a particular report, you can go there and seek a declaration that based on this and that, such a particular person is not suitable. That is one way. But the most effective way, especially for the common mwananchi, is education. There's just no shortcut on that. We needed to do education more, and then civic education should not be just on an election year, 3 months to election. Yeah, that's why we miss it. Civic education should be continuous. Okay, we should see more prosecutions going on, and then when people see that, then they see this thing is real, it's working.
So they're able to understand the threshold, that if somebody does this, they get prosecuted and the conviction follows.
Yes.
Excuse me. Let's talk about that for a moment, because I think when we talk about leadership and integrity in Chapter 6, we only think it's necessarily directed at the elected officials, but it refers to all public servants. Isn't that why we then had the vetting of magistrates and judges? Let's talk about that process. Are you happy with how it went on? I know we're having this conversation with David yesterday, talking about the vetting of judges and magistrates and how it's a very public affair, and in some cases perhaps scares away some candidates who might be, you know, very qualified for the position, but are scared of what sometimes looks like a witch hunt. Are you happy with how the vetting of judges and magistrates has been done?
What you can say from institutional standpoint, we would have wanted more. Okay, we would have wanted more. We feel that some of the judicial officers got through the cracks, but we have to live with it. It doesn't have to be perfect. Again, the vetting and the Law Society of Kenya participated robustly in that. Most of the complaints were brought by our members or the public who brought them to the Law Society of Kenya. We saw a little bit of double standards on certain determinations that were given. But for us to move on, we have accepted the outcome, and we are not contesting.
When you say as the LSK you'd have wanted more,
yes,
what do you mean exactly?
The Council of the Law Society looked at the various determinations that were given. And we found that on certain judicial officers, the same threshold that was used to remove them, okay, when it was applied to others,
It was reduced.
it was reduced and they were found to be suitable.
Okay.
So that is the only issue that we had.
Okay.
But as a process, the Law Society has supported that vetting. And in fact, it was the Law Society of Kenya who demanded that particular aspect to be put as part of our constitution for us to transit to the new dispensation.
Okay.
In fact, the public wanted all judicial officers to go home and reapply for their jobs. But as a compromise, it was now agreed that let them stay, but they let them be vetted, and the ones who are found suitable can continue.
Okay, all right, David?
Yes, Yvonne, we must understand that we're just an evolving democracy. We will be 50 years old this year, as the so-called Jubilee year. And if you compare ourselves to the developed countries, US, for example, over 230 years of democracy.
Right.
So for me, there's been a lot of progress. Who would have imagined that a person seeking the office of president in Kenya would be asked about molasses plant for Raila, that Uhuru Kenyatta could be asked about 30,000 acres of land in Taveta, that Martha Karua could be asked about how she handled the tallying at KICC, that Ole Kiapi would be asked about the missing funds in Ministry of Education. So for me, there's been a lot of progress, but I think it's also the time to up the gear. The questions we have about judiciary, and which I'm confronted with on the digital platform every day, is that what happens to cases which were determined by these very honorable judges if they have been found
unfit
to
and
be
it's
serving?
based on some of the judgments
Is
that
there
they
any
made in the
recourse
past?
to law?
Yes.
Is anybody who is serving, who was sentenced by such a judge, would they have recourse to law? And then going into the election, is there recourse again? Maybe our lawyer friends will explain to us that if you feel that you have an issue against a governor who's been voted into office, can you go to court and challenge his election based on integrity in past records?
That's right. Perhaps, Wangoi, you can bring that into perspective. Will we now see a barrage of cases coming up and saying, I was under this judge, you've now declared him unfit based on his work? And could we now see that coming back?
I think not, for the simple reason that one has to draw a line somewhere. I think the provisions in the Constitution that deal with integrity, the processes that have been involved with regard to vetting are prospective. So, you know, if the judges are now starting with a clean slate, they'll be held accountable for future conduct. In the same regard, this issue of whether or not governors and other state officers who are elected are going to be held accountable, I think the Constitution sets up an excellent framework for that. You can recall your governor, you can recall your member of parliament or your county assembly representative for failure to perform. So the question becomes, what exactly are they required to do? And that's where the media, again, can play a really active role in informing people, almost like a roll call. How often does your county assembly member actually turn up for, matters that are pending in the House? How often is your MP actually in the House doing their jobs? We need to have that kind of information published in a more ongoing fashion so that we can have a sense of exactly what it is they're doing for us, where they are. Both Parliament and the county assemblies also have the power to either impeach in the case of Parliament or to petition for the resignation of the governor in the case of the county assembly. So again, as your representatives, they'll be working for you. They'll be seeking to ensure that the people who are in these executive offices are actually doing their jobs. And it's an interactive process. Citizens elect and then monitor, and then the elected representatives represent and then monitor as well. So the Constitution sets up a really good framework. The question is, we as citizens must be active in seeking the kind of information that would make this system work for us.
Okay. Going forward, we know now what's happened to Chapter 6. Do we have any plans for operationalizing this fully like it was intended for 2017? For example, who should be the one to vet any candidate running for any electable seat in the country, Apollo?
That is a very big question. Right now, we have several commissions: Commission on Administrative Justice, Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission. we have several commissions, and the question is, who has been given that mandate? That mandate has not been given to a specific commission or body.
Who should it be given to?
Actually, the vetting should be done by a multiplicity of bodies, starting from the public through social vetting, the judiciary through cases that can be brought up by the public, and also by these commissions that we have. But even going forward, and this question which Oito asked, whether does somebody has a recourse for a judgment that was given by a judicial officer who has been removed or determined as unsuitable. Yes, in the Supreme Court Act, Section 13, there is a provision for that purposes. But I cannot elaborate further because that provision is now being litigated, whether it is constitutional or not. So I cannot say much on it. But yes, there is an existing provision in the Supreme Court Act, Section 13.
All right. But going forward, what do we need to do in 2017 so we are clear on the vetting process, on who does the vetting, and what that threshold is to the point where we get the spirit of Chapter 6 maintained? Because I suppose now we could say, it was a new constitution, a lot of new things happening. It's a new dawn and a new reality. But we now have 5 years between now and 2017 to make sure that this works. What is the next step going forward? Let's look beyond March the 4th now.
Going forward, I think we'll have to look at the Leadership and Integrity Act again with a view of strengthening it. And secondly, I think Chapter 6 is going to be implemented more through public interest litigation. That is how to breathe life into it, because it is not a very easy chapter to implement. People are asking about the threshold. And I think the judiciary is going to be a major player in determining the suitability or otherwise of individuals. But again, we cannot wish away education. We must reorient and do the curriculum for civic education must be changed. We cannot just do it the way we've been doing it before.
At the risk of sounding like a pessimist, we have to educate ourselves on what integrity is. We really have to tell ourselves that I need someone who's honest and who keeps their word and who keeps his promises or her promises and does what he says he will do with the money. Have we really gotten to that level as Kenyans that we need to remind ourselves of some of these things should be ingrained in our DNA, right or wrong, Wangui?
No, I think it reflects the gap that Apollo is pointing out. We actually don't have a clear understanding of what our government is supposed to do for us and who should be held responsible for failure. And it's a reflection of the fact that the game has changed. It was the case that an MP was also a cabinet minister, was also, so they would both legislate and execute and monitor the performance of their respective departments in executing their mandates. Now that those things have been separated, there's a real chance for people to be accountable for the things that they are supposed to do. I think that comes back to this issue of what role the media and other information sources can play. It's really important that the coverage of politics in this country shift from coverage of individuals and of scandals to coverage of systems and processes and how things are supposed to work. There's a reason why CDF funds, for example, have been misused, in egregious fashion for the last 8 or 9 years. The only time we get to hear about it is when you see a headline saying, 250 million shillings worth of CDF misappropriated. But we don't understand how CDF is supposed to work. We don't understand who's supposed to be on the committee, what kind of projects they're supposed to be. These projects are not published on a regular basis so that you can see what alleged schools or footpaths or other things are being built with your funds. The media doesn't do enough of an investigative role with regard to reporting on these matters, going to this alleged school and finding that it's an overgrown field, going to a road reserve and identifying that there are houses that have been built on it, so it hasn't actually been constructed, even though the funds had been dispersed. It's that kind of accountability where it now becomes clear, because we've separated the roles of each of these 3 arms of government, we can actively track who is doing what. And if they have not delivered, again, it's in the public domain. One can know for a fact that their MP has misappropriated certain funds. One can know for a fact that a department that was supposed to do a particular activity has not followed through. That's the kind of accountability and education that will empower citizens to make the right choices.
Okay, all right. So I do understand where you're coming from. It's all about educating them on knowing what they should expect from which leaders for what in timelines and that sort of thing. And that is what I think Apollo is saying should happen throughout the course of it, not just 3 months to an election. All right, David, again, the issue of leadership and integrity being made alive in every Kenyan, from that Nairobian to the person in a rural village. How do we get that? How do we now make this? What do we do now? Because we've got 3 days to the election. What's the least we can do as the voters now, as the electorate, to try and, you know, restore some sanity and say, fine, a lot of things have happened or that shouldn't have happened. A lot of things that should have happened didn't. But what can we do now to try in our very own small way as ordinary Kenyans to make Chapter 6 alive come March the 4th?
Well, I think Apollo opened it by saying social vetting remains very crucial. And we expected various players, you know, and stakeholders to take a key role here, from the churches we go to the mosques we go to the small women group and men groups that we attend as individuals, so that we can start prodding individuals. Are you fit enough to be my county assembly rep? Are you good enough to be the woman representative for my county? And the challenge is that there's been a very little time to allow for comprehensive civic education after the promulgation of the new constitution. But that does not stop us from continuous education, which should happen every day. And everybody that has an idea or two that can make a voter be more informed ahead of Monday, I think it's absolutely right. We've seen so much campaigns on TV. There's so much campaigns on radio. I'm told Law Society of Kenya today has a road show to try and, you know, tell people a few issues about leadership and integrity. But going forward, I think the only solution is we must keep the fire burning. We must keep the latent spirit of the Constitution alive and ensure that these individuals are asked all manners of questions and they remain accountable to the people.
Okay. I'm sure we'll see a lot of door-to-door campaigns going on now, particularly with those who are a little closer to us, the county women's rep, the county ward rep as well. Perhaps your advice or suggestions to Kenyans as they come door to door and say, hey, my name is so-and-so and I'm from this political party and this is what I want to do. Remind us again about that minimum threshold, something we can put up in our own minds and in our hearts and say, for me as a Kenyan, this is what I want, this is my threshold, this is what I will accept, this is what I will not accept, based on the promises we're going to hear in the next 2 days, because we will hear quite a number of them. Apollo, remind us of what we should keep in mind, even as the 200 shillings will be dished out, which we know it will, the 500 shillings that will be brought with a packet of sugar or whatever. Just remind us about what we need to have in mind for March 4th.
The first thing you have to have in mind is that don't look at tribe when you're voting. Okay? Vote for the candidate who offers a better deal for yourself, who has convinced you. And any person knocking on your door, selling the policy of a candidate, ask a question. Where has this person been? What has he done? What does he promise to do? And how does he intend to do what he's promising to do? Because, as you say, there's going to be a lot of promises. Some of them cannot be achieved in the period or in the manner that are being propagated by the candidates. So, as a minimum, that is the most important thing. Ask your question whether that candidate, has that candidate been involved in any scandal? Has that candidate been jailed? How has that candidate behaved? These are questions that...
Does he have proper papers?
Yes.
Yes.
Has he gone to school, academic?
There you go.
These are simple things
Yes.
that I think any member of public can interrogate any person selling policies of any particular candidate.
Okay.
For me, that is the minimum. But again, peacefully listen, give a hearing to everybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah, don't start shouting just because you don't like where that person is coming from or the party. Give a hearing.
Okay.
And after the hearing, go and sit down and
think about
and
it
think
and
about
reflect.
what they and reflect.
Absolutely, and
Yes.
listen to everybody. Thank you for
Yes.
that, Apollo. David, your final words?
Final word is that look at these candidates. They are going to be with you for the next 5 years, and as Wangoi said, if they don't perform the first 5, 6, 7 months, I mean, you have an opportunity to recall them. We are still teething. Let's give them a chance. We have come so far, and it's our chance to turn a new leaf on this country and propel this country to the next level. But again, let us remember that the quality of leadership depends on the voter.
Yeah.
We vote them into office.
Yeah.
So if we vote the thieves, if we vote those who have low moral standing, then we will pay the price.
Yeah, we
We
cannot.
lose 300 billion shillings every year to corruption in this country. And this is the time to start sealing
Yeah.
those loopholes.
Okay, absolutely. And it really is up to us, Chapter 6, leadership and integrity and the choices that we make, is it not, Wangoi?
It is. And the first choice you have to make is to vote. Because unless your voice is heard at the ballot, you cannot actively engage these leaders in any kind of accountability. So first vote, and I would say the second order of business is stay involved. Don't assume that you've given someone a mandate for 5 years and wait for them to come back 5 years later and persuade you to give them a second chance.
Right.
We need to vote and we need to stay engaged.
Okay, so that is the first thing, really. It really is going out to vote, but also staying involved. Because I think we vote on March the 4th and then we'll just sit back and let everything happen. And then 2017, a few months to the election, then we'll start saying, my leader didn't do this. Let's talk about that involvement just very quickly as we conclude. The involvement of the voter beyond 3 months to the election, beyond the day of the election, beyond the release of the results. After that, I think it's just hands off. Wangoi, how do they get involved more going forward?
I think first, you start to follow up in the papers and in the news on what is actually happening at each level of government that you have elected to understand who is doing what. It's really just paying attention. I think the second aspect of involvement is going to be inviting your elected leaders to fora where you can participate and engage them one-on-one. So don't allow people to insist that the only form of political communication in Kenya is a rally.
Yes.
Bring them in,
Yes.
bring them into churches, bring them into professional associations, invite them to come and engage with you, and then show up. Because people have a bad habit of saying nobody ever comes to address them,
Right.
but should you organize an event, only 2 or 3 gather.
That's right.
So cast your vote, invite your leaders to come in and speak to you and develop priorities with you, and then attend and participate in these kinds of fora.
Okay, all right. Be involved throughout, not just during the election. We've been talking about leadership and integrity, and we'll have our quote of the day just a moment from now to tell you about what your role and responsibility is in terms of you being a voter, and that'll be our quote. But first, just taking a look at leadership and integrity. Like Wangoi said, stay involved, not just now, but throughout. Apollo mentioning the fact that civic education is required throughout, and both Apollo and David saying, look, right now, leadership and integrity is all up to you. It depends on who you decide come March the 4th for the next 5 years. You elect in someone with questionable character, you surely cannot expect to get quality leadership. You surely cannot expect to get honest projects that are put up in the time that they say they will. And most importantly, listen to everybody that comes your way. Not just as a political rally, but listen to them one-on-one, and then sit down, make that choice on your own and reflect. We've been talking about leadership and integrity. Remember, Wangoi Kanyari stays with us on Choice 2013 this morning. We'll be talking about the Kenya we want later on and furthering this discussion. But before we take the break and go into our discussion with the IEBC, I'd like to leave you with our quote of the day today, and it comes from Larry Sabato. This will most probably be the last quote that we talk about when it comes to elections this morning. We are talking about the elections, and the quote of the day today: every election is determined by the people who show up. It's as simple as that. Every election is determined by the people who show up. That is our quote of the day, and it's coming on your screens in just a moment for you to be able to take a look at that and reflect. There you go. Every election is determined by the people who show up. What are you going to be doing on March the 4th? You'd best show up for that. We take a short break right now. We speak with the IEBC. We take a look at those ballot boxes. What do they look like? Any last minute questions that you've got, make sure this is your forum to understand what will be expected of you March the 4th. All of that and more after this short break. leadership integrity. And I think also now continue to educate the people. This is what your governor should do. This is what your county rep, because many people still don't understand. So that 6 months into it, 1 year into, they can vet them and say,
Right.
I know what you're supposed to do and you're not doing it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Thank you as well. You too. You're on a road show, eh?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Let's do some. Yes. Somebody will assist you. Where is she?
No, there's a difference between electronic voter registration and then electronic voting. What we have done is electronic voter registration. And this is just to ensure that our register has more integrity.
Okay.
And when it comes to voting, the voting will be manual because as you can see, we have ballot boxes. You just have to come physically, mark the ballots, dip them, and then we count physically as you watch. Not the way that an electronic system would do, where you just just key in a code and then it is tallied electronically from even remote places. So they are different.
Okay. All right. Yep. So the only electronic part of this whole process is the identification.
Yes, it's the identification.
Okay. The rest we vote with